begin by expressing appreciation to our co-sponsors, the UVU Department of History and Political Science, the Office of International Affairs and Diplomacy, and the Alexander Hamilton Society. We will begin tonight's lecture by an introduction of Dr. Kangas by Ambassador Baktibek Adresaev, a distinguished associate faculty at the Center. After the introduction, Dr. Kangas will present his remarks, and we will proceed until that point. Ambassador Adresaev.
Good evening, Dr. Kangas, Dr. Griffin, distinguished guests, and my colleagues. Before introducing our distinguished guest, Dr. Kangas, I would like just to say a few words about this series and center, and especially that passion and determination of the leader of the center, Dr. Griffin, during several years of really hard to create one of the great institutions dedicated to that course. Founding and again founding. And I'm really grateful to him that he was listening when I was saying, Dr. Griffin, don't focus only on American founding. Let's, look how that founding will be helping to the nations overseas, Central Asia, to do the better job. And I'm really glad that during that year and a half we were able to host here several distinguished guests, kids of Parliament. Now you are already here. And it's some kind of really great synergy from two sides. And again, UV is not a novice in that area, and I would like also to inform you, Dr. Kangas, that in 2010, it was a very delicate situation, maybe you remember, in Kyrgyzstan, where unfortunately embassy was not yet, didn't have a good connection. But 2008 and 9, UVU and our colleagues were able to host so many opposition leaders, including Pekebayev. Was a tricky situation when they developed a new constitution, absolutely new from the zero. And National Endowment for Democracy and people who were working there were asking how to deliver them some of the comments. And it went through the UV, because many people here had really great relationships and worked closely. And this friendship continues till now. So that's why this is a great place, a great institution, and I'm sure that years ahead we'll find with you many other interesting topics to discuss. But I'd like to say, first of all, that with Dr. Kangas, we know each other from the last century, yeah? Yes. Before the 1999, yeah? And now he is academic dean and professor of Central Asian Studies at Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And previously, Dr. Kangas was honored to serve as a professor of Central Asian Studies at George Marshall Center for European Security in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. I was dreaming to go there, but unfortunately, because of my position, I was not invited. You're inviting guys from Kyrgyzstan, and my wife, she was invited for 6 months. But this is a great place, and thank you for again helping for many people from our regions to get advanced in security issues and studies. And if you will continue to read again bio of our distinguished guest, we could probably need to pay attention to a special feature in his bio that from the beginning, probably 1992, Dr. Kangas already was focusing on the Central Asia and Caucasus, dedication, and I would say even probably luck, yeah? And until now, with the Pentagon, State Department, with other institutions, he still continues to do this. So he was a deputy director of the Central Asian Institute Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. And we were fortunate to host here Fred Starr many times. He was your mentor and still continue to do it. Then important also position Central Asia course coordinator at Foreign Service Institute for the U.S. Department of State. By the way, for my students, when we are thinking about internships and other programs, we need again to approach you and ask your advice. Different positions in Prague, Open Media Research Institute, and also the assistant professor of political science at the University of Mississippi. In addition to this, he has plenty of experience dealing with the Pentagon, and especially as an advisor to the combatant commands in the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, United States Air Force Special Operations School, then National Democratic Institute. Remember, we are talking about the National Democratic Institute as one of the institutions which helps to promote the constitution around the world. International Research and Exchanges Board, another important institution for those who would like to do research overseas, and if you need scholarship here, plenty of experience how to do it in the right way. American councils. By the way, American Council we were able to get as our partner for sustainable mountain development. So we already have here a network. Yeah? Academy for Education and Development, United States Information Agency, United States Agency for International Development, and other United States government agencies on issues relating to Central and South Asia, Russia, and South Caucasus. By the way, he was one of the first scholars who started to study situation in Caucasus and Chechnya. So this is very important to mention. Currently, he is also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University. Dr. Kangas holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service and Comparative Politics from the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and PhD in Political Science from Indiana University. And it's my great pleasure again to meet Dr. Roger Kangas. Please welcome and
thank you so much for those kind words, and I hope to live up to the pedestal you put me on. As I listen to this too, I do realize it's been a while, and to say it's been a last century when we met, I guess that's true. It's been a while, but the interest in the region has not changed, and again, I look forward to discussing Central Asia with you all today. What I'd like to do, and understanding that your center focuses on law, constitutions, and if you want to say historic frameworks for countries, I'd like to shape my presentation in that context, looking at the challenges for political reform. We could go down the path of saying, country by country, here's who's president, here's who the succession strategies could be, and is there a possibility for democratization or not? That's possible. Or we could say, how might these systems frame themselves to become democratic? And it's a sort of a challenge right there, because with each of these countries, what I would say is we have to look at some common roots and some common challenges. And what I'd like to do is to look at these common roots, to think historically, as we look outside, and I sort of was given the tour of your center and noticing the sort of highlights, the key intellectual founders of the American legal tradition and constitutional tradition. It's imperative that we do the same with other states. What are the legal and constitutional traditions in Central Asia? We sometimes don't phrase it that way, and we don't think of it that way, but I do believe it's important to understand it in that context, because it's only when we know what is the broad framework within which these countries reside, then we can better understand how do they develop, what are the challenges facing them today, and quite frankly, what are the possibilities and probabilities of success, and I hate to say of failure. So I'll try to do that in a relatively want to say short amount of time, but I'd like to keep my comments pointed because I'd actually enjoy engaging in a conversation and quite frankly getting to know your thoughts on these and having an exchange on these ideas. And so that's how I'd like to attack this evening's topic. Now, when it comes to legal antecedents, it's important to note that Central Asia has had, in fact, a long history of, if you will, legalism and legal studies. Documents and books in the area, and of course in a variety of languages, show that there's quite a robust tradition in the region. And I look at these really in sort of two contexts, a pre-Russian context and a Russian context, and even that latter one we can divide between an imperial and a Soviet. And there's no question that we have to at least acknowledge the tradition, Islamic legal tradition that arrived in Central Asia definitely by the 8th and 9th centuries. And as we get into the 10th and 11th centuries, Central Asia, particularly Bukhara, becomes a center of legal studies. If we think in terms of Sharia law, and I know that today there's all sorts of images and ideas of what Sharia law is in the modern context, but if we go back to 11th, 12th century and really taking us up to the 16th century, we see that this is sort of a continuum of Sunni Islamic traditions. Hanafi legal code develops in this region and quite frankly is applied. And so what you find with the various emirates and khanates, the empires that developed in the region, Sharia law actually becomes a foundational element. But with that, and what's important here, and quite frankly we see this in all Muslim societies, we have a combination of both this theocratic structure, but also local traditions and cultures. We could call it adat, we could call it customary law, we could call it sort of local habits, traditions, etc. We go a little farther south and we look at Afghanistan. Of course, we like to talk about Pushtun Wali and say, here's this code, here's this behavior pattern that people apply. Hospitality to outside guests, a certain treatment of family relations, the concept of revenge, the concept of just punishment. These are elements that come into play. And by the way, I should say, when I talk about Central Asia, while I'm thinking often of the 5 post-Soviet states, on occasion I'm bringing in Afghanistan. I do think of it as a Central Asian country, and sometimes it offers, I think, some interesting examples. But as we look at this foundation, we start to see layers and layers, almost looking at a geological site, right? We see layers of new traditions in place. When Genghis Khan and the Mongols came into the region, we normally think in terms of bloodletting and destruction and towers of skulls and all sorts of other good sort of violent images. They also did something that in some ways is even more horrifying. They introduced public administration. And in this tradition, and it is something that is, I think, better studied now in the sort of tradition of the Mongol Empire and Mongolian influences, is they took a lot of the legalism and the administrative capacity of China and started applying it in other parts of their empire. As they go east to west, it's a way to help administer, it's a way to help count, it's a way to help manage an empire that is spanning the known world. If you look at the reach of the Mongol Empire today, and sort of imagine what it must have been like back then, a pretty daunting task for a small nomadic group that basically did everything on horseback. Well, they actually did manage the empire, and so by bringing in public administration and by bringing in an accounting mechanism, they started to codify the system, and they took a lot of these traditions and customs that we would see from the past and started to create, if you will, a legal structure, possibilities for recourse, possibilities for adjudication. This is typified by someone who comes from the Mongol tradition, although he's not considered that, and that's Emir Timur. The Timurid Empire, coming out of Samarkand, or in the west, he was often called Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame. He had a variety of monikers. He actually comes from this, as I said, this Mongol legal tradition and applies this throughout much of the Timurid Empire. I only raise this because, and kind of stress that Mongol link, because in modern Uzbekistan, he's actually seen as an Uzbek hero, and this Mongol lineage is ignored. The Uzbeks actually were the ones that came after the Timurids. Modest change. And so we sit here, and this is now my 4 minutes of history, and we'll say, wow, with all of this going on, how did we get into this modern era? And what we see, and I hate to say from a legal tradition, I've just described the high point. And from then on, and really from the 15th, 16th century onward, we see, unfortunately, a downward slide. It is a period where you had competing khanes, Kokhan, Bukhara, Khiva, as well as other nomadic groups, traditions, the various Juzes of the Kazakh peoples, and each of these tried to develop their own traditions, their own habits, applying Sharia law irregularly, I would say, in some cases more firmly than others, but we start to see variation in the region. And there's no question that this variation of legal traditions is really sort of understood because there was variation in political rulership, political control. So, as we walk through this history, you're saying, well, when are we going to get to the modern era? We actually hit this major break point, and what I think is really a rupture that is critical in understanding the legal tradition in the region today with the introduction of outside forces, because this is going to be a theme we'll see including up through and including 2014. But of course, if we go back to, say, the 1600s and 1700s, particularly with the rise of Imperial Russia coming into first the territories of Kazakh, what we would later call Kazakhstan, and then by the 19th century into the rest of Central Asia, we see other traditions coming into play. And these other traditions, to boil it down and almost sort of overly simplifying the change, is we see an introduction of what we would later call a continental or really almost a French legal tradition in the region. And we say this, of course, because if you're a student of Russian history, you know the connection that Imperial Russia had with France, and even in the post-Napoleonic era, when we look at Alexander I and Alexander II, and they're taking French legal codes, French legal traditions, and applying them in the Russian context, it's going to apply in Central Asia as well, but as a colonial holding. And it's important to note that throughout the imperial period, and I sort of think of this in terms of 1850s, 1860s, really until 1917, when it collapses, they really applied sort of an interesting trend, which was they were going to take Russian legal codes, Russian law, and apply that to the Russian citizens in the region. In terms of locals, those of other ethnicities, we would later call these Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. We would have other names, Karg, Kyrgyz, Sarts, and other names were used at the time. The sense was they're going to keep using their local traditions, local codes, unless there's an issue that needs to be adjudicated across culture. So already at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, we're looking at this cross-cultural challenge. What do we do when we have a criminal case where the defendant might be Sarg, and we would say Uzbek today, and the other side would be a Russian. And of course, you had the choice, and sometimes the defendant would be allowed to choose would they use Russian law or would they use local law. And believe it or not, this sort of laissez-faire attitude that Imperial Russia applied sort of made both sides aware of each other's traditions. And I would say today we're seeing much greater scholarship in this area. We're sort of learning a lot more of how the legal traditions of the Imperial Russian communities and the local communities interacted or didn't interact, which was more often the case. But that comes to an abrupt end, of course, with the Soviet period. And this is now where we get into the, if you want to say, the real challenge facing the Central Asian states today, because there's no question that this 74-year period, 1917 to 1991, the Soviet experience in Central Asia, really helped shape the current constitutions and legal regimes that I would argue the foundations for political reform and change. And what do I mean by this? Well, what we have is, with the Soviet period, it was almost this sense of we need to completely dispense with anything we've had in the past and start new. Because we're now going to create a modern Soviet system. We're now going to create a modern legal code that for the first time will be fair, will not have the trappings of sort of these relics or remnants of the past, and in that in particular we're looking at Sharia law. Islam is going to be challenged in the region during much of this period, particularly during religious laws that were enacted in 1918, 1929, where we really see restrictions placed on Sharia law in particular, but on Islam in general, but also where we're rethinking how law is applied. And it's important to note that what we see is the introduction of something we would call socialist law and order. Well, what exactly does this mean? Because it's going to be the defining framework for the legal and constitutional code of the region. And what it means basically is that law itself is there to help, not just, it's there to help protect the system, it's there to protect economic development, social engineering, you know, the shaping of this new Soviet manner, turning Central Asians into Soviets, you know, trying to transcend ethnicity, trying to transcend local traditions. We're going to use legal frameworks to do this. It's something pretty new, something pretty innovative. You might say it's idealistic, you might say it's kind of way out there, but these are the sorts of traditions and trends we see. And so what you find, and as you read Soviet legal codes and also the Soviet constitutions, you see a nod to individual rights, individual freedoms, etc., but increasingly and importantly you see obligations to the state. That citizen obligations are actually paramount. Citizen obligations that may be, quite frankly, are more important than citizens' rights. That citizens' rights, in fact, have to be limited if they infringe upon society or the state. Now, those of you who studied, you know, legal traditions in, say, the Soviet era or in other systems, I would say counter to what we're sort of used to in the United States or broadly in the West, this notion of socialist law and order is critical in understanding the current regime. And this even goes, you know, if you think some of the latest modifications, you know, 1987, you know, the CPSU, just as an example, they passed a resolution entitled "On Measures to Increase the Role of the Prosecutor's Oversight in Strengthening Socialist Legality and Law and Order." That's a mouthful. It actually reads easier in Russian. You know, the goal was actually to take socialist legal codes, and this is during the Gorbachev perestroika era. This is when we're talking about reform. The notion is still controlling, managing the legal code to manage society, to frame society. And there's going to be, you know, challenges here. And I would say for the Central Asian states themselves, when they gained independence in 1991, you know, all sorts of challenges are in place. How are you going to manage your economy? How are you going to set your borders? How are you going to create your political structures? And honestly, and why I spent, you know, these first sort of 10, 15 minutes on history of constitutionalism and legal views in the region, it's actually how do you set that up? And it's interesting, and this now takes us obviously to the modern era, and I'll sort of spend a few moments looking at the challenges they face. The Central Asian states collectively faced a common challenge. We have a 1977 constitution, Soviet constitution that we're following. We have a legal code that's been modified up through the 1980s. Do we keep these? Do we throw them out? Do we adopt something new? What sorts of challenges do we have? Now, a whole host of outsiders came in to offer their advice. The American Bar Association actually was leading the way. Those of you who are interested in the legal profession, they actually had a project at the time, the Central European and Eurasian Legal Initiative, CELI, which was a way for very high-priced lawyers to make themselves feel better by taking a year off without salary and going to various countries and helping to establish legal codes and constitutions. And we saw this in every country in the region in 1991, 92. And what we saw here was this sense of taking the legal structures, taking the legal codes of each of the countries, and trying to modify, adapt them. Now, we can go country by country, and all I would say is, for each of them, you're going to see the same pattern. You're going to see this pattern of a country that is taking its initial document and looking at this notion, again, remember, socialist law and order, of sort of these principles of the obligation of citizens, the principles of using law to help guide social engineering, using law to help guide the economy, thinking of law as an active measure, thinking of this institution, this organization, as something that you can help shape your society. Instead of doing it in one broad Soviet stretch, you're now going to do it individually. Okay, and so almost initially you see the legislators and particularly the executives of each of the countries decide this is exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take this, shape it in our, in each, I should say, Union Republic had its own constitution. We're going to take these Union Republic constitutions, modify them, and present them out. Now, in their defense, the notion of sort of a long, very sort of verbose, multi-article constitution is typical. 150 articles, 140 articles, 187 articles. That's actually normal. I mean, Americans tend not to think that way. We tend to think of a constitution that you can put on the back of a 3x5 index card and say, yeah, here are the main points, we got it. Because we think in terms, in fact, if you're British, you don't even need a 3x5 card. You just assume it's there. But on the continent, and this gets to that why the Imperial Russian influence is critical, the notion of having a fully written constitution is there. And so we saw this country by country by country. And, a good example, and I mentioned this ADA Sealy project, in December of 1992, the Uzbek government presented the American Bar Association with the document and said, this is our constitution, our draft constitution. We're going to enact this. We'd love your comments and feedback. And I will tell you, for about 3 months, the American Bar Association had been actually asking the Uzbek government, we'd love to help you out. Like, yeah, we'd like your help. We'll get back to you. And sort of 3 months later, they finally said, yeah, this was December 1st, in fact, 1992. They said, here it is. We'd love your feedback. This is great. It just so happened on December 8th, they passed the Constitution. Sealy did bring back their recommendations, and I still have their recommendation packet, which, they took this Constitution and really ripped it to shreds and said, oh, you need to do this. Here's an inconsistency. By reading this, it suggests that the executive is going to have supreme power. Don't you see a problem with that? On and on and on. They actually got a very pleasant response saying, we'll take your comments under advisement, and thank you so much for your interest, et cetera, long after the Constitution had been passed. None of their recommendations were accepted. We had other forms of constitutional engineering that took place in Kazakhstan 4 years later. Nursultan Nazarbayev was facing a rather odd situation. He had a legislature that actually thought the Constitution meant something, that they actually thought that 3 branches of government could compete. And so they challenged a budget of his, and actually didn't really like what he had to say, and were challenging some of the Nazarbayev elements in it. He turns around and actually finds that he's going to be unable to they're going to overturn his veto, that in fact the legislature is going to win out. So he actually pulls a little known trick. I mean, I doubt anyone's ever saw this coming. He dissolved the legislature, called it a short state of emergency, and rewrote the Constitution. And in his rewriting of the Constitution, this ability to veto and override vetoes mysteriously vanished. And in fact, if a legislature overrode a presidential veto, he has the right to dissolve them and call for new elections. Suffice to say that since that time, in 1995, the Kazakh legislature has yet to challenge the president. So, we have constitutional engineering in that way. In the Turkmen case, we have a constitution very much from the old Soviet tradition, and it really is almost a verbatim rewrite of the 1977 Soviet tradition, with an added element, of course, of emphasizing, if you want to say, the historic role of the executive, and taking the executive of Turkmenistan as almost an individual, not even just above the law, but above society, which is sort of an interesting challenge here. How do you sort of rationalize this in, if you want to say, a true legal context, a true constitutional context? The first president, Saparmurad Niyazov, again, not only looked at his legal documents as something to perhaps listen to or read, I doubt he read them, but he put along with this his own writings called Rukhnama, which also became legally justified. In fact, he considered a Rukhnama to be a higher legal document than the Constitution, and in fact, at one point said it is on par with the Quran. Now, fortunately, someone in his inner circle must have told him, I don't know, probably in a moment of fear, said, basically, sir, this isn't going to fly. To say that Rukhnama is on par with the Quran is probably not the right thing to do. So he actually backed down on that, and after that one time, we never heard him utter that phrase, which is a good thing. But clearly there's a sense of it being above law. Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, the current president, has de-emphasized Rukhnama has sort of retinkered or modified the Constitution to some extent, but quite frankly, again, as we see with the others, there's a constant, if you want to say, selective adherence to the law. And then, just to give justice to the other states, Tajikistan's constitution was born out of conflict during the Civil War, and it was one of those odd moments where their initial effort to democratize and their initial effort to actually adhere to rule of law, believe it or not, was working. In 1991-92, Tajikistan arguably could have been one of the most, you could say, was the most progressive country in the region. They had a presidential election that was actually contested. They had a multi-party system, and they actually had opposition parties that were using the legal framework of the country to justify their positions and justify their actions. Not bad. Of course, as the Civil War broke out, those justifications vanished. The Constitution is rewritten, and it's written by the victors. And it's written by Imam Rahman and his staff, who clearly set it up, again, to parallel what we see in these other states. And in fact, often we look at these three southern countries, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, as having an overly emphasized executive structure. Kazakhstan, perhaps acknowledging the rights of other organizations, but clearly having a supreme executive. And the last country, I should say, Kyrgyzstan, is one that has had probably the more unique history. I think they're on, what, their 7th constitution? I think some in the room would know that well. They constantly reworked it, and the parliamentary constitution that we have is actually unlike any of the others in the region. Now, it is only a couple years old, so let's see, how, if it's adhered to in the future, if the governments actually abide by it, and if the governments actually follow it. And when I mean governments, I mean right now successive administrations coming through. We need to see, if you want to say, legal peaceful transitions. We've had one. Sometimes the most difficult one is that second one. So let's see when the next round of elections take place, will the constitutional framework actually be followed? Right now, if you want to say the scorecard suggests it's not bad, that there actually is an adherence, even if sometimes it's messy politics. I always qualify that by saying, and by acknowledging, sort of full disclosure, I am from Chicago, and adherence to rule of law in politics, it's optional. And so, if it's good in Chicago, by golly, it should be good in Bishkek. And so we'll see what happens. But I sort of note these just kind of as an overview of the Constitution. What I'd like to do is just sort of note a couple of key final points in terms of challenges facing these countries and facing the legal structures and the political structures, and then open it up for broader discussion. And the first challenge, of course, is everything I've suggested here, that sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room, is corruption, is a lack of adherence to the constitutions. When we have political leaders who use the constitutions to justify extension of power, to justify control of other economic branches or other economic entities of the government, to suppress opposition parties, it's problematic. And just quite frankly, to get rich, if you want to put it simply. It's difficult to prosecute them. It's difficult to go after them. I was working on an anti-corruption program in Kazakhstan one year, and it's an interesting question that we were asking and that our Kazakh partners were raising, which was, at what point do you as an individual, as a Kazakh citizen, or as a Western business in Kazakhstan, at what point do you say, something wrong is happening, I'm going to sue, I'm going to the court, I'm going to the police? Or do you say, the Hakim here, I need to talk to him, and I need to talk to his people, and I need to kind of take care of things. There's a local strongman that I need to deal with. There's this guy here that we know he's influential. I'm going to talk to him, and that'll solve my problems. At what point do you take these other forms of adjudication, these other forms of redress, so to speak, not use those, but rather say, I'm going to court, I'm going to sue? Now, it's interesting, there was a study done a year and a half ago that was looking at this in the Russian context, because of course the stereotype is, oh, in Russia there's no legal structure, everyone just kind of goes and you have to bribe and you have to do this. But believe it or not, for common offenses and for common economic crimes. I'm not talking about the celebrated cases of key opposition figures that Putin likes to put in jail, or musicians. If you call them musicians, I don't know. It's a case issue. But if you look at individuals who have real criminal activities or problems or lawsuits, believe it or not, it's now something like 70% use the legal system first and foremost. That's not bad. I mean, it's getting better. There's an upward trajectory that people are actually finding confidence in the legal system in apolitical situations. You know, if it's a political situation, different story. Do you see this in other countries? In this case in Kazakhstan, or this experience in Kazakhstan suggested at the time, the answer was no. That the majority of people still felt that they couldn't use the legal framework in the country for redress, that they actually had to go to some strong man and other things. Second challenge we have in the countries is retribution. And I've already hinted at this, that we can use the legal code to go after opponents. I'll pick on Uzbekistan, I suppose, that we have opposition figures. In fact, early on you had opposition figures that were legal members of the legislature and actually legally ran for office. They lost shortly after that. They're being prosecuted and they're being literally hounded out of the country. Relatives are now going to be trumped up on economic charges. The legal regime is going to go after them. Especially after 2001, but I would actually put the year more like 1998. Islamic trends or Islamic extremism is used as an excuse to go after people. That is, the legal code is now going to look at Islamic extremism and religious factors as elements that you can use to go after individuals, that they're a threat to society. And of course, this is broadly interpreted. So to go after an opposition figure and say, they're part of the Hizb ut-Tahrir, or they're part of some other group that is attempting to overthrow the Uzbek government, this is critical. In fact, part of the history and what makes the Andijan episodes in Uzbekistan, which is an event of sort of mass violence in May of 2005 in the Fergana city of Andijan. Part of this was based on a prosecution of 23 Muslim businessmen who were deemed extremists. Were they extremists, or were they simply devout individuals who were businessmen? That is still the question being discussed in the region today. And you even have the case, and this was sort of a rather, I would say, a hearkening back to the Soviet era, and I would even say the Stalinist era. When Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov took power in Turkmenistan, that is when his predecessor passed away, Niyazi passed away in December of 2006, the key leaders, the key officials in the government banded together. They took the health minister, actually, and made him the interim president. And the feeling is, okay, this guy is going to be kind of weak. He's not in the power ministry, so this will be easy. Well, very quickly, he starts going after his opponents. The Speaker of the Parliament is called upon charges of treason. The Minister of the Interior is called upon charges of treason. The Minister of Defense is quickly retired. We have one individual after another in senior positions who are placed away. We had an assassination attempt on his predecessor, and key individuals involved with that were called upon charges of treason and anti-state behavior. And this sort of anti-state behavior is actually almost verbatim the same code, the same legal structure that we had in the Soviet period. Sent off to labor camps, never to be seen, in some instances never to be seen again. A couple have actually resurfaced, but it's clear that using law for retribution is something that the governments have on occasion exercised. And then just, I would say, lastly, the concept of transparency. And this is what makes it particularly problematic. In each of the countries, there have at times been associations of lawyers and law students who've tried to, if you want to say, have an open skies policy, like, let's create an NGO that deals with legal transparency in our country. And they model it after the legal associations in the U.S. And even, a group like yours would feel right at home with them. Unfortunately, these young law students, mostly young law students, many of whom were educated in the West, realized that they were coming up against a rather difficult barrier in challenging these governments. And so, these sorts of challenges that we see in the countries in their legal codes are really, in my opinion, inhibiting the possibility of broader political reform. And then lastly, I should say, the issue of external influences is still coming to play. Now, I made comments earlier about groups like the American Bar Association. We have organizations, the European Union has played a role. We have non-governmental organizations like Freedom House, particularly their publication, Nations in Transit, which look at political reform and legal codes and constitutional developments in the country. And generally, they give poor marks to the Central Asian states. Now, two things that are important to bring up. One is that they give these poor marks because they're basing it on Western standards, you could say. They're looking at European and American standards of jurisprudence, American and legal standards of electoral behavior, American and European standards of civil society. And applying those standards to Turkmenistan or to Uzbekistan is difficult. And for those of you who don't, you should look at this Nations in Transit report. Freedomhouse.org is the website, and then the publication is Nations in Transit. And what they'll do is they'll evaluate a country on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 meaning perfectly democratic, parentheses Finland, and 7 perfectly undemocratic or non-democratic, in parentheses North Korea, and Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. They even have this thing, the worst 20 countries of the world, and Central Asia. Actually, I think even Tajikistan squeaks its way into that group too. And they're down there with Zimbabwe and other countries. But and so you could say, and I bring up this first point, that these evaluations are based on recognizable standards that you would know and you would accept, but perhaps in the region and displays of the other side of the coin are increasingly getting challenged. I would say efforts to reform not just legal codes, but efforts to reform the government were received, accepted, I should say, or at least tested in the 1990s. Maybe not fully accepted, and in fact, perhaps just the verbiage was accepted. But what you're seeing today, 2014, is definitely a distancing of these efforts. In fact, we've been working with the State Department on trying to reevaluate U.S. policy in the region, and you have this community of international human rights and labor, the sort of folks who look at good issues, are saying, okay, now that we've desecuritized our relationship in Central Asia, we need to hit them hard on issues like human rights, election laws, minority rights, etc. And the reality is, many of those efforts wouldn't even be allowed today. In the 1990s, you could have a group doing electoral reform. You could have a group coming in to talk about legal reform in a country, looking at court cases, looking at how judges behave, looking at how lawyers, the Procuracy Office behaves. Today, you probably wouldn't get that kind of access. One of the last persons who was able to do this had his jaw broken when he was trying to look at political reform efforts. And most have been kicked out of the respective countries or who've not been getting visas to even enter the countries. And so you almost see now a distancing of these efforts. I put this in a broader context. We've seen such behavior, obviously, in Russia. Ukraine has had a hit-and-miss policy on this. Now that Yanukovych is out, maybe they get to come back in. We'll see. But this clearly has been a challenge for political reform. And I would add to that, and noting other external reviewers, and this particularly is the case now of role models we see in neighboring states. Vladimir Putin likes to discuss the issue of sovereign democracy and the notion of, that's a good one. It's like democratic centralism. Once you've made up your mind, it's law. But sovereign democracy actually suggests that the state, in and of itself, is an entity that can be democratic, even though its rulership is authoritarian. I know you have to twist your head around that for a moment, but the notion that it's actually part of our local culture. Why I spent sort of those first moments on the Russian and Soviet experience, Putin actually, and I should say his staff, I don't think he personally is writing any of this, but his staff is drawing back on some of these old traditions, imperial Russian traditions, what they see as the positive elements of the Soviet period. And in fact, here is an individual who does believe, and I think when he said it, it wasn't just rhetoric, that he does believe the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst moment of the 20th century. And so what he's doing is harkening back to that era and saying, what elements can we draw to create a sovereign democracy? We have to use the word democracy in our country. This is getting interesting airplay, if you will, and journal play in Central Asia. Uzbek scholars, for example, have spent a lot of time on the question of sovereign democracy. Tajik scholars have looked at this as well. The other element, quite frankly, is out of China. We think of the Washington consensus, and they like to tout the Beijing consensus. You know, the Washington consensus on sort of liberal market economy systems, you know, capitalism is good, etc. Out of China, what we see is the notion of a state-managed system. That is, economic behavior and elements of market capitalism are good. We need these. But it has to be framed in a way that fits our society and our cultural norms, which is not individual-based. And so you take, and you know, for China, they can look at their very long history of law. I mean, again, thinking back to the Mongolians I mentioned, who actually themselves stole Chinese legal tradition and Chinese public administration, they can harken back to that and say, this is a distinct Asian quality. That's something we need to consider. No surprise I start to see this coming up out of Central Asian publications and Central Asian speeches, whether it is Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan, when they look at the idea of the Chinese model. And so I highlight these as yet more obstacles in this broad road or broad thinking in terms of political change and reform. Now, a lot more I could say, but what I'd like to do is stop there and then open it up for your questions, your thoughts, comments, etc. So I'll open it up, please.